Hey everyone, Mr. Chaffin here. Today we are going to continue our talk about the causes of the American Revolution, and today we have a pretty serious one actually. It is kind of this series of events that eventually leads to a major resentment on the part of the colonists toward their king and toward sort of the throne over in England. Okay, and so what we're talking about today is the French and Indian War and how it eventually led to what was called the Proclamation of 1763. Okay, so let's start with the French and Indian War. And so to kind of get a little context for this, you have to understand that back over in Europe, there was always and always had been a lot of competition, a lot of rivalry is a nice way to put it. But basically, there were a couple countries that really just hated each other, okay? And two of these countries were England and France. And so England and France had been at war so many times throughout the centuries that it almost became hard to keep count. And so in the kind of mid-1700s, mid-18th century, they had another war, which was actually part of something called the 100 Years' War, but that's irrelevant to what we're talking about. But this latest conflict was called the 7 Years' War. And the 7 Years' War was sort of kind of like a world war. It involved a lot of different European nations, but the two major players were France and England. And so the French and Indian War was just sort of one theater or one sort of part of the world that this fight was taking place. And so France and England were really trying to battle over superiority in North America. In particular, they were fighting over a piece of land called the Ohio River Valley. The Ohio River Valley is sort of right up the middle of what is now the United States of America. And it's basically everything from the Mississippi River east all the way to the Appalachian Mountains, and then kind of up into what is current-day Canada and that whole Great Lakes region. And so the Ohio River Valley was a super fertile piece of land, and so it was highly valued by the French, who really had settled it first, and they really were growing wealthy off the fur trade from this area. But English colonists were now starting to make their way west and found that the land was really fertile for farming. And so England, Great Britain, really wanted this land. And of course, France is not just going to give it up. They had even built forts out in this territory to basically secure their fur trade there. But that didn't deter the colonists, and that certainly didn't deter the King of England from wanting to get this land. And so eventually the 7 Years' War conflict that's going over like in Europe and India and other places around the world comes to North America. And so the French and Indian War really is this battle between, get this now, the British and the French. Okay, with a name like the French and Indian War, a lot of people think, oh, it's between the French and the Indians. Well, no, it's between the French and the British. Now, both sides did have Native American allies, but in the end, the French relied much more heavily on their native allies than the British did. And so the French and Indian War kind of becomes very early on really good for the French because they knew the territory well, and they kind of had a home field advantage. But as the war continued, the British just had too many troops. They had too many experienced generals in the field, and honestly, they depended far less on the Native Americans as allies, and so they were able to kind of rout the French eventually, even with the leadership of a guy named William Pitt. And there's a famous American that sort of gets introduced during the French and Indian War, and his name is George Washington. So at this point, George Washington is a very young member of the Virginia militia. And so he serves in the French and Indian War as part of the British Army, okay? So it's sort of a introduction to one of the most famous certainly war heroes and presidents in American history, right here in the French and Indian War. Okay, so like I said, everything went the French way early on, but eventually, the British were just too much, and they eventually win the French and Indian War, and so they take over all of this Ohio River Valley land. And so part of what was exciting for the colonists is that they believed that the king of England was going to, King George III by this point, was going to sort of allow them to move onto onto this land, okay? So there's a lot of backstory here, but here's a little bit. A lot of the colonists were actually very willing and wanting to enlist in the British Army in defense of the throne, in defense of Great Britain, in defense of their mother country, really. But the king was very suspicious about their motives. He really thought that they were trying to basically, win independence or something. And so he didn't let them. He just went ahead and sent his own British regulars, the Redcoats, over to fight this war. And so that caused a lot of resentment in the hearts of colonists because they were wanting to fight really to secure this land so that England could grow, Great Britain could grow, and the colonists could move on to this fertile land. And then after it was all over, the king basically took away that idea or that promise of prosperity and growth by creating what was called the Proclamation Line of 1763. And so after the French and Indian War, of course, Great Britain was in a lot of debt. They had basically fought all over the world for 7 years, including in North America. And so Parliament and the king over in England, they decided that in order to get that money back, they're going to raise taxes and all that kind of stuff. But they did something else that was sort of really just kind of a dagger in the heart a little bit of the colonists. And they drew this line called the Proclamation Line of 1763. And it basically followed the Appalachian Mountains, which of course had been kind of a natural boundary or barrier for all the decades and centuries leading up to this point. I mean, the colonists basically just knew that the Appalachian Mountains were the western boundary of the colonies. But with this war being won, they really thought that now everything over the mountains was kind of fair game, and they were going to enter into this new, land of fertile soil and all these other things. But the king issues this proclamation, which, a proclamation is just announcing something real important. It's just saying something important. It's like declaring something. You're proclaiming something. And so this proclamation basically says that the king doesn't want to pay for any more wars against the Indians. He doesn't want any more attacks from the natives on the colonists. So they're forbidden. You have to hear this. He forbade, he said, you cannot go past the Appalachian Mountains or there will be consequences. You will be punished, okay? And so the colonists really resented this because they knew that the real reason why he didn't want them to go west was not because of native attacks, even though those were happening. That's real. The real reason why he didn't want them to go is because he didn't want to lose control of them. He didn't want to lose control of the colonists in this one little space in between the Atlantic Ocean and the Appalachian Mountains. And so this became a major sticking point for the colonists moving forward because it limited where they could go. All right. So if you get anything from this lesson today, it should be this: the French and Indian War, which Britain won, and so they got all this new land in the Ohio River Valley. They should have been able to move west onto that land, but the king said no. He proclaimed the Proclamation of 1763. He said, here's a line, don't cross it. So here's the Appalachian Mountains, don't go past them, okay? And so if you're a colonist, you're hearing this and basically saying, you know what, I was willing to fight and die to grow this empire, to grow this nation, and here you are telling me I can't go past this line. So imagine what that does to the mentality of the 13 colonies after this is done. Okay, so as we continue talking about other causes of the war, this really becomes one of the first times that the colonists realize that, you know what, I'm not so sure that the king has our back. I'm not so sure that our mother country really cares about us in the way that they should, especially with how hard we're working and how much stuff we're sending back to them. So just keep that in mind. The Proclamation Line of 1763 becomes that moment where the king says, no, you cannot cross the Appalachian Mountains. You cannot move west. And the colonists get really angry. They get really frustrated, and they get really kind of insulted and over it in a sense. Okay, so we'll move forward in our next video and talk about some of the things that really did the colonists in. But for today, Proclamation Line of 1763, the king said, don't cross the line. Don't cross the line. Okay, if you have any questions, send me an email. We'll get it cleared up for you. If not, we'll talk to you in the next video. Bye, guys.